Hello and welcome to Let Them Eat Cake. My name is Jack. My co-hosts are John and Ace. This will be episode 23, and this week we will be covering what, John?
This week we're releasing an episode that's about information warfare and semi-state security formations, which is kind of the modern word for mercenary. I almost said mercenary. The modern word for mercenary, because I think mercenaries kind of, you think of like the South African commandos and the helicopters and things like that, but it's really a different world now with like Eric Prince running wild in Libya. Now Wagner is pulling out and going back to Africa. You see, Wagner also sent the Americans like a letter, and it was like written like how a child would write a letter to Santa Claus.
I did see that actually.
Yeah,
It was
so
quite entertaining.
It's actually about information warfare, stuff like that.
Well, the funny thing about that, the Wagner letter, is that it kind of reads similar to how Russia did the whole "can we join NATO" thing. It kind of reads oh yeah, well we offered, but they clearly don't care about
it's not a
security
real
in Africa.
It's not a real request. They know it's not going to happen.
It's not real.
Yeah,
right. It's all information warfare, which is interesting and pertinent to bring up because of the episode.
Yeah, like one of the things, because like we recorded it like 2 weeks ago, but what's interesting is we talk about nukes, and he says that Putin's best bet is to move nukes to Belarus. That's his best move that he can play right now. And what is he doing? Exactly that now.
Even though the only person with nukes in the fight is him, and his use of them will be a poison pill. Like, nobody's going to work with him if he doesn't.
Yeah, well, but as soon as nukes go off, the threat loses all its power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing. This is like that's why I always say like the nuclear threat is stronger than the nuclear bomb. Because look at how much we've gotten done with nuclear threats compared to nuclear bombs. So anyway, let's go through some headlines.
Who's gone first?
I mean, I'm sure you're geared up and ready to go to talk about fat people.
Okay, so the World Health Organization is looking to make an anti-diabetes drug an essential medication. We vaguely looked over a couple articles and couldn't figure out whether it was just the news. Using fat drug being considered by World Health Organization, but diseases tied to obesity due to personal choices should not be covered by the taxpayer. That's
what does that have to do with being an essential medicine?
Because it's not an essential medicine. You could eat less and walk more, and
but wait, well, I guess if you're on I'm thinking from our perspective, it's more of like if insurance will cover it here, and like it depends. Like I think New Jersey has passed something that says insurance has to cover it.
See, but that's a completely different discussion, because coming from Australia or Canada, whatever fucking country has universal healthcare, I guess you could call it. It's not really it's not, but I don't even think the Australian one covers obesity drugs, but type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes are very different things.
What's the fat version called of it? But Ozempic, right? So this drug, it's actually got huge black market value. You know how like you'll see stuff where it'll like you'll see signs that will say like you'll sell you Viagra, or they'll buy you Viagra in a lot of places. I've seen signs here on the side of the road, homemade signs that saying like they will buy Ozempic per pill off of you, but it's very open.
Interesting.
Like it's it's like Lucy's.
Interesting, because the one thing that really sticks out here is this sentence here, right? A decision by the World Health Organization to include Saxenda, which is the obesity drug. Novo Nordisk is the company that patented the medication, which is Saxenda, but it's coming off patent, which is why the World Health Organization is considering it, because it'll be a general. So they say eventual generics on the list for adults would mark a new approach to global obesity by the health agency. This is where my issue comes in, because our approach to global obesity should be destroying the companies that sell poison to people and making them admit that their shit isn't healthy. And it's funny that I go into this because
once upon a time we sold people literal radioactive paint.
Yes.
All right, yes. Like this has not been a new thing where companies are killing people.
No, but it's just another thing on top of everything that should be controlled.
But what if it saves lives?
Don't be fat.
What if it saves like thousands and thousands of lives?
Walk more. Everything is available to everybody. People are just lazy. Drugs don't make you any less lazy. And this is wait. And this is what happens with weight loss surgeries. Is people get these surgeries, but they don't change anything.
And then they get killed by the
overeating, and then they get fat again. Because it doesn't work, because it's just a cheap trick that fat people use to cope. Leave all this in.
Hold on. I want to bring it back to a point that John made pre-show. It's like, what about freak accidents from like participation in certain like athletics or sports?
Obesity isn't a freak accident.
Where it's like someone.
No,
I don't know.
He's got
a lot of people
there's people you fucking injure your back. You injure your back, and like it can just be a chain of events.
Okay, then it comes down to a case by case.
If you look at people who are obese in the United States, for example, it's mostly poor people.
But that's the thing is that it already is a case by case basis about how to get this drug. We don't have unlimited drugs. We don't have. There's not like we can't just like hand everything out to people. Like drugs have shortages, right? And that's the main issue with this drug is that they need it.
So get people
because
eating healthier. And
let me finish. They need it because it's for obesity, right? They already need it for obesity. So there is a certain supply going to those people that it's pretty much a drug that's actually saving their lives because they or not. I meant to say diabetes. It's going to people with diabetes. Like they need that for diabetes, right? So then you have this extra share over here that's the completely different drug. It's the same drug, but it's marketed differently. That's for obesity, right? So you have the same thing going in there. That means the supply coming off the actual chemical is limited, right? So when you go into things like lap band surgeries, they don't just look at you and be like, yeah, you're good. Like they normally tell you need to lose like 200 pounds before you get one. You need to qualify for one. All that same shit goes into this drug when it gets prescribed. It would be extremely irresponsible for doctors to just be throwing pills out. So it should be treated exactly the same as in a lap band surgery. It's just an alternative to getting surgery is how it should be treated. This also comes down to free trade and capitalism, right? If this company can produce this so much extra and can market it for obesity, why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they make a profit off of that?
I'm not talking about the company. I'm talking about the World Health Organization preferring drugs over healthiness. That's my problem.
The thing is that it's ultimately what it comes down to is they're preferring drug over elective surgery.
But there's a third option. The third option is walking. That's all you need to do. Get those stubby, fat little legs and go for a fucking walk. Eat less. Count your calories and you'll lose weight. It's really not that hard. I've been eating KFC for 4 fucking months and all I've been doing is counting calories and I've lost 25 kilos. Fuck you. Next. Being healthy.
Is the main reason that they're doing it for diabetes?
Look, yes, but at the end of the day, type 2 diabetes Type 2 diabetes is not a natural disease. Type 2 diabetes exists
if we have medicine that helps people not die.
Being fat produces diabetic responses in the body. If you aren't fat, you don't get that response. You don't need the medication. Walk, eat less. That's all you need to do.
Or there's a fourth option. Crystal meth. Okay, and transition time.
It costs me nothing.
Medicine can save lives, but we also need water.
Oh yeah. So we got over with our friends in Somalia. So a new report released by the Somali government suggests that far more people, and mostly like over half of which were children, died due to drought. And this is kind of being attributed to the climate crisis as well. It is I shouldn't say being attributed to the climate crisis. It is because of the climate crisis. And yeah, it's kind of hard to get like complete information on this. A lot of articles state this just because of how remote Somalia is, and you're relying on numbers from the Somali government, which is, you know, not great. And so between 2018, I'm sorry, in 2022, I'm sorry, there were 43,000 excess deaths in Somalia. And this is being compared to 2017 and 2018. So they're officially having more deaths from drought than the years of 2017 and 2018. And they expect an extra 34,000 deaths to occur within the first 6 months of 2023. Now, granted, this article and most of these reports are coming as of March 21st, 2023. So we'll wait and see a couple more months and see if, you know, their numbers come out to be correct. Hopefully they don't, but likely they will. Could be worse than that. Here's a quick quote from Somalia's health minister, Dr. Ali Hajdi Adam Abu Bakr. He says, "We continue to be concerned about the level and scale of the public health impact of this deepening and protracted food crisis in Somalia. At the same time, we are optimistic if we can sustain our ongoing and scaled up health and nutrition actions and humanitarian response to save the lives and protect the health of our vulnerable, we can push back the risk of famine forever." What you're hearing there is that from the Somali health minister is that even though there have been all these deaths due to famine and whatnot, sorry, not famine, due to droughts, he's basically optimistic because a famine had been averted. So that, I just think that kind of goes to show on the scale of how fucked Somalia is.
It's like when you see
You know.
somebody burned to death, and then somebody goes, "Well, at least they didn't drown."
Yeah, right. At least they didn't burn and drown. So yeah, so again, according to this article from The Guardian, for the first time, a prediction model was developed from the study. A forecast from January to June 2023 estimates that 135 people a day might also die due to the crisis, with total deaths being projected at between 18,100 and 34,200 during this period. The drought in Somalia is worse than people think, and it's even worse than the drought that occurred in 2017, 2018.
The earth is running out of water. Like, we are probably going to run out of water before we run out of oil at this point.
That's why Bill Gates is planning a massive.
So the 2017 Somali
Bill Gates,
drought
dude.
left.
You shouldn't have to count on philanthropy from the fucking ultra wealthy to
I don't
save
think you
people's
heard what I
lives.
said.
Let me tell you this: dude, this whole thing about Somalia being remote and bullshit. That's a main trade route right there.
Yeah, it's not remote.
It's always been a main trade route there, right? So to supply these people with water,
Well, I don't think
and it
they're
comes
saying
down
it's
to
remote.
is water a human
pockets.
right? Should we be giving people water? We have the ability to do it. You know, maybe we shouldn't just be using as much slave cotton and take some of that excess water and fucking give people some water.
Jesus.
Don't talk over me.
Recording this punch to your face. But in any case, the 2017 Somali drought left half the Somali population facing food shortages. So, I mean, yeah, it kind of goes back to the thing we talk about a lot on this show, where it's like the climate crisis is going to really fuck over like the poor, like the global poor. I'm not talking about like just the poor in Western countries, but it's mostly going to fuck over the poor in, you know, less developed countries, the third world, if you will.
Also, for capitalism to continue, we need the resources that are in Africa. So we can't. We literally they'll back themselves into a corner if they destroy all the workers there.
So I mean, this again, based on everything we've just told you, this is essentially saying that the drought back in this current drought, or you could call it an extension of the drought from 2017, 2018, which left half the population in food and water shortages, could get worse. That's basically what they're saying. They're saying like, yeah, you know, the drought that started in 2017, 2018 was bad. It left our whole, like half our country ravaged, but it's gonna get a lot worse, big man. It's gonna get real shitty.
What's that meme? It's like, I told you it was about to get worse.
Hello, friend.
It hasn't even started, or something like that.
Hey, friend,
you know, like if Al Qaeda prioritized giving people water, they'd win a lot of people over.
What was that?
If Al Qaeda
dude, they would
prioritized
be
giving people
kings.
water,
They would
they
be
would win a
kings.
lot of people over.
Oh, yeah, it would be a global movement.
Hmm. See, that's the
They,
thing.
they don't. They don't.
Yeah,
look
Al Shabaab should
That's
partner
why
up with
that's why
Evian.
Al Qaeda needs to hire me. I got the big ideas.
Head
Okay, so anyway,
strategist
so let's talk about some
of Al
crisis in the
Qaeda
Middle
police,
East.
John.
Israel is descending into fascism.
Descending.
Well, so it's currently being led by a Holocaust revisionist. People don't know this, but Benjamin Netanyahu is a Holocaust revisionist. He says that Hitler didn't actually want to kill the Jews; it was the Arabs. The Arabs basically made Hitler do it, and that's why the Holocaust happened.
Pop off, Ace. Go.
He's kind of basing this off of this whole thing. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, for those of you who are familiar with memes, this is the imam who looks like Ryan Gosling and met with Hitler, and he's the one who kind of was the spiritual leader for a lot of Muslim brigades in the Nazi army, like the Jordanian one and the Azeri one and the Bosnian one. And a lot of people in the wingers believe that this is the somehow like convinced Hitler to eliminate all the Jews.
I've actually been doing a lot of research on this specifically, because I've been looking into a lot about like the roots of like the National Socialism and stuff. And one of the things that's interesting is that Mussolini wasn't anti-Semitic until he met Hitler, and Mussolini's girlfriend is Jewish, so Mussolini believed that you could convert the Jew, and like the nationalism is the replacement for religion, which comes from Robespierre, right? And then Hitler, he was different, where he saw Jew as an ethnicity, where you couldn't get the Jew out of them. And there's like this book, it's called like The Poison Mushroom, and it's almost like a children's book of just like of how it's just like Nazi propaganda of like how the Jews are poisonous and stuff, and it's just like showing them as like all this capitalist iconography that you see nowadays, where it shows like the pig capitalist and stuff like that. Like it all comes from the Nazis. All of that anti-capitalist rhetoric and stuff like that, like the Nazis did all of that to begin with. Historical record, we have like historical propaganda record of this anti-Semitism. Like it's so preserved, it's undeniable where it starts, and the pathway to the Holocaust.
Speaking of historical records, so Hajj Amin al-Husseini, again, the imam that Netanyahu likes to blame for kind of suggesting the idea of exterminating the Jews to Hitler. Where he gets this idea is that Husseini visits Berlin in 1941. Netanyahu's whole thing is like, okay, he visited Berlin in 1941. He was the one who suggested it to Hitler. Here's the funny thing. There's a German document that is readily available online that proves this whole thing to be false. I would say it does, because if you believe this idea, then it kind of pulls into the whole like kind of what a lot of Israelis and Jews believe about Arabs from a propaganda perspective, where it's like they're like, oh, these Arabs just want us gone, they want us exterminated, etc. The Arabs didn't want the Jews in Palestine at the time, and the Germans obviously were just insanely anti-Semitic and wanted to get rid of them. Now there's no actual record of Hajj Amin al-Husseini telling Hitler, hey, you should do the Holocaust, you should kill all the Jews in Europe. There's no record of him saying that in this 1941 meeting. Now the interesting thing about this is that there were a lot of Arabs, like journalists and writers at the time, who were opposed to the Axis powers, because you got to remember, at the same time, the Axis powers were infringing on Arab territory, aka look at the Battle of El Alamein and what happened in Egypt. Look at the Italian occupation of Libya.
We should probably save that for like a expansionist discussion on that whole area.
Because again, you could say that the majority of Arabs at the time, sure, they didn't want Jews in Palestine, but that doesn't necessarily like equate to them, being friendly with the Axis powers because of what was going on in Libya, what was going on in Egypt, things like that.
Do we even know if they knew that? Like, how many people were aware of the Holocaust at that time?
Exactly. That's an even more obvious point. Like, did they even know? Like, did they even know that Hitler was gonna like kill all these Jews?
I feel like
Probably
no.
not. Not
I
these
feel like it
not
wasn't
these
really
journalists and
realized
writers who were
until it wasn't really realized until the early 40s.
I mean, they really,
Yep.
really didn't know until the end.
Yeah, like
That's the
the
thing.
true extent of it, no, but
Yeah,
like
that's
they
the
kind
thing.
of got a feel of it in the early 40s once they realized that the Jews were being rounded up in
But
France.
Ho Chi Minh also offered the founder of Israel, like Ben Gurion, I think. How do you
Mm.
pronounce his name? Do you know specifically?
Ben Gurion. I think that's how you
Ben
say it.
Gurion. Yeah, Ho
Gurion.
Chi Minh told him that they can establish a Jewish state in Vietnam,
What the
and
fuck?
he declined, and he said that he was confident that he would start a Jewish state in Palestine. He literally said the words Palestine at the time. So he said, "I'm going to start a Jewish state in Palestine." He declined Ho Chi Minh's offer to
Yeah,
have
that wasn't
safety there.
an uncommon thing. Like if you look at a lot of like posters from the time where it's like they would try to that were targeted towards like Jews who wanted to move to Palestine, it would literally say, "Come to Palestine." It would literally say that. It would say like, "Life, yada yada yada."
Expanding with that, we have Iran today, and I mean, the Palestinian conflict is very hot right now. I don't know. The fact that the forces that you see coming out of West Bank and the training they have, like obviously it has to come from IRGC, but like who knows what else?
Hundred
Like
percent.
who knows what else is in there? But then so there's been escalations with Iran and the U.S. as well now because um, basically I know that there were volunteers. 5 Americans died, and I think someone in the YPG died. So we talk about this a lot because normally we talk about Israel bombing Iran. Israel is bombing Iran constantly. They're always bombing IRGC targets, and how it's not really a big deal. This one is a little bit different because Americans died in. So it says a strike on Thursday, a suspected Iranian-made drone, a U.S. contractor, and killed a U.S. contractor and wounded 6 other Americans in northeast Syria. And I think those Americans were, because it doesn't say American soldiers, so I think they were YPG, but I'd have to check because
For internationalists?
it would be no, it was one contractor and then 6 Americans. So 7 people got hit with this strike. It killed one, and the U.S. retaliated against it. So five. It's multiple attacks target U.S. bases in Syria after airstrike hits Iran-backed groups. So, like this is like normally Iran doesn't have that type of retaliation. So that started with Iran killing somebody, then we bombed IRGC targets in Syria, which is not common. We normally Israel does that. We normally bomb them in Iraq, and Israel will do Syria. So that was already abnormal, and then the fact that they retaliated again and hit 5 more bases, and it kind of brings up the reminder of like the last escalation where they like shot. I think a lot of Americans got concussions because they hit so many missiles on the American base. It didn't like kill anyone though. After they killed Qasem Soleimani. I guess that's that. We'll transition into our interview now on information warfare.
We have a weapon more powerful than the British Empire, and that weapon is our refusal to bow to any order but our own, any institution but our own.
So my name's Alec. I have an MA in international security, and I'm doing freelance journalism at the moment. My main focus has been around like private military companies, Russian foreign policy, Russian defense, and also Ukraine at the moment. And yeah, that's pretty much me.
What's the difference between like a private military company and like a mercenary? Because like I always think of like South Africa when I hear mercenaries. Where's the line draw there?
There is a good paper that I read on this, which basically argues that the word mercenary itself doesn't really mean anything anymore. In general, it was a vague term used to refer to someone who fought for money. But the problem is when you're trying to distinguish between like private military companies or like black market, private armies, it's not really a helpful phrase to use. What I would say was Executive Outcomes as a private military company. They had an office probably somewhere in London. They had offshore accounts going somewhere. We know that they were from South Africa. and they were providing services through contracts. And most of that, you could trace with paperwork. You could probably buy shares in the company that Executive Outcomes was owned under. Whereas with an irregular private army, like, I don't know, for example, a force in Liberia of, people that just fight for money on the black market, they're not going to have any ties to a company. And, you literally have to approach them in a very informal way to hire them. That's really the main difference. It's normally the kind of corporate structure that they're under, the way you'd access them, the way they're funded, that kind of thing. That's what distinguishes them, really.
Who's the most notorious, top 3 most notorious PMCs?
I would say the ones that are most impactful are DynCorp, Blackwater, in terms of reputation, and people call Wagner a private military company. I don't really agree with that, but I guess if you're talking about these weird money for hire formations, that Wagner would probably be up there as well now.
If you wouldn't call Wagner that, what are they?
So Kimberly Martin uses the term semi-state security formation because Wagner was founded by the GRU and the Russian Ministry of Defense. They are basically a created state venture. And they don't quite occupy just a regular military function, but they don't also occupy a mercenary function. They kind of do a bit of both. Some of what they do is just for money. A lot of it is just work for the Russian state. So they're in this really weird gray area. They're not marketing their services like Blackwater would. And they probably don't need to secure contracts with the Russian government in a formal way that, Blackwater would have to with the American government, for example.
I thought you could hire them as long as you're not American.
Wagner? No.
They helped shut down China when COVID started. There was some on the roadways there.
Wagner basically is normally part of some kind of deal that you'd strike with the Russian government. You'd have to be in the graces of the Russian government, and they might provide services based on that. But a lot of the times when they've been provided in Africa, for example, it's been part of economic trade deals. So for example, there was this trade deal struck with the Central African Republic, and Wagner was just one component of that. So technically, the Russian government has to vouch for you before Wagner ever turns up anywhere you are. Whereas, Blackwater could hire from could be hired from any NATO country without having to approach, the US government directly for it.
You can't get Blackwater out of the room. Every time you turn, I think there was just something where Ukrainians were like, "Oh, this is a great solution." I'm like, guys, no, do not get Eric Prince involved with your defense. He's constantly trying to sell something to someone. He's also implicated with Trump or something like that. There was a lot of stuff going on there, a lot of fishy stuff.
The interesting thing is he approached Wagner at one point regarding Libya. He's actually helped General Khalifa Haftar bypass UN arms embargoes by trying to traffic in weapons for him. So yeah, Eric Prince is a notoriously flexible and unreliable partner, and also just when Ukraine's trying to be a Western country, the last thing that it wants to do is to hire someone that's just the antithesis of just breaking international law and not having red lines and just a lot of mess. There's a reason why the Americans buried him after Iraq completely. Just on a formal basis, they just stopped using him, really. So he moved to Dubai and set up that weird venture there that failed, and then he helped Haftar.
Trump is using him, though. Crawled right into that circle.
Well, he was always connected to the right-wing political establishment. I mean, he's the relative of Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos, rather. So there are people that I think want him to come back into the fold, but they're not serious people in Washington. Most of them know that he's baggage. Or if you're going to do work with him, it's going to have to be very informal. You're not bringing him for the large contracts that you had, for example, for executive protection in Iraq that was State Department issued, or logistics, from the DoD. That ship has definitely sailed especially after what he's been implicated for doing in other countries.
Why not just go work for Russia then?
Russia's not a good market, and it's political suicide. China, now that's a good market.
Yeah, I saw he
He's
was
in a
trying to
company
get
called
involved
G
there.
Services. He is involved. He's a shareholder and an active member of G Services. That's the name of the company. And that's stationed out of Hong Kong. And I mean, if it's stationed in Hong Kong, we know who it really works for, right? Majority Chinese board of directors and everything. He's already involved in places he shouldn't be if he wants to work with the Americans. So he's also doing Middle Eastern stuff too, but so is everyone. The Gulf monarchies want private armies quite badly because they have relatively small populations and most of them don't want to serve.
But what's interesting with these Gulf states, I've brought it up before, but there's like in Jordan, that's kind of where like all these like Gulf leaders go to buy their guns, and they have like this massive training grounds in Jordan and stuff. So like they get these like complexes built all over these like authoritarian regimes to like train like elite ops and stuff like that. So it's a very interesting market down there because it all goes through Jordan, and Jordan is just like you never hear about them, and it's like that's how to play the game, you know? Like they're on top, I think.
Those states are just a really big source of money because they all don't want to conscript their population. They don't have enough volunteers, and they all know that there is a lot of former American and Western guys that don't necessarily want to move on from the military. So it's a perfect solution for everyone involved. And all those Gulf countries, obviously, they have great relations with America and the West. So basically, all of it's approved. And the Gulf states are obviously always worried about Iran. They're always worried about the protection of natural resources in the near vicinity. And these companies are perfect for like protecting oil rigs in like places that are not so stable, like Libya, for example. We know that there's a company called Black Shield based from the Emirates that had German former army guys, and they were helping Haftar guard oil fields and stuff like that, and mineral extraction facilities. So it wasn't just Wagner that was there. There's a lot of people looking for that kind of work in those states.
Who are their interests? What are their interest groups? Are they just the Gulf states there, or is it like other people? For like, what other entities is getting Russian funding or Chinese funding or American funding? Any sort of big state?
All.
So, in what sense? In what sense? Yeah, probably all.
Like, and to what extent is this more
So if we're
proxy
talking
conflict through PMCs?
let's talk about like colonialism here. You know, like the Middle East, that's ours, all right? Russia isn't getting in there because you know they're more friendly with Iran, right? So it's like that, but also the Middle East can also be considered North Africa, where you have Libya and Egypt. I think Egypt is pretty much basically NATO at this point, but then it gets a little sketchy the further out you go. Morocco, that's basically NATO. So there's different alliances and how these states are going to line up. You know, I think that's what he's trying to get at.
Who do you think is backing Haftar?
NATO
Haftar
NATO has some people in there, but we've brought this up before a few times because there's a few NATO guys in there. But also, like, you know, people end up on different sides on everything, but it's still like NATO's a very broad category. That's the thing with the tankies. They think it's like a unifying, like, imperial force where it's like supreme command and things like that. But, you know, Morocco isn't going anywhere because they're not interested in having like an Arab Spring or anything like that. So they're just gonna, you know, do whatever they need to do to keep themselves just fine. And with Libya unstable, Morocco's benefiting anyway. So,
and there is only one NATO ally that's screwing over all those NATO allies supporting Haftar, and that's Turkey. Arguably, when the Russians when Russia sent in the Wagner guys to help General Haftar, initially they were doing really well, and Haftar was on the up, and all of a sudden came along these Turkish Bayraktar drones on the side of the government of national accord, and they blew the living crap out of them, because the Russian anti-air systems were not doing what they were set to do, which is to respond to threats like that. And it's very interesting. People think that on all sides, NATO
Why
has
can't
like
we
this
drone
unified
Assad,
view,
though?
and everyone's really happy. I'm not sure people are prepped for what happens after Assad. That's the problem. I don't think there's any idea of what you go and do after Assad's gone.
The power vacuum would be insane.
It's why the Turkish are warming up to working with them on the Kurd issue. Because it's just easy. It's just far easier solution for Turkey. It's why have a whole destabilized state when you can just deal with the actual only one that you have any political incentive to deal with, which is just like the Kurdish population, right? Why have a destabilized Assad and all of that? It's just too messy for them.
This is where Turkey's
Same with the
running
Americans. I'm
into a
not sure
brick
they're
wall,
prepped to
though.
deal with it.
Turkey's running into a brick wall here because the Syrians went through a genocide. They had nerve agent used against them. That's like, it's like trying to pacify the Kurdish resistance against Saddam. It just wasn't going to happen. And it's not going to happen this time either. So the fact to think that you could make Syria a stable state with Assad in power is just kind of like a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. And the
No
thing
one
is
wants
like,
to. I was just going to say, no one wants to invest resources in getting him out. That's the problem, because you're not necessarily wrong. Until Assad is there, things are probably never going to be good.
I don't
But
think it's going to
nobody
be
is
that long
willing
until
to.
we see it. I don't think it's going to be that long.
There's arguments for weakening Russia and Iran by screwing Assad over. I think that might get everyone on side. That's the one thing that I think is really bad for Russia is that warm water port they have in Tartus that they got because they worked for Assad. That might go, and we all know who's going to help whichever forces get rid of Russian occupation there or Assad forces there. We know which kind of countries will be helping that, right? We already see Israel striking the crap out of IRGC targets. I'm sure the Americans might warm up to giving the SDF more stuff.
The Israeli, where we know that a major bombing on Iran is upcoming. It's just going to happen. We know it is. And we've been seeing these small drone attacks on their munitions all the time. But I was listening, there's this great YouTuber, Professor James Lindsay. He was talking about how there might be a Ukrainian motive in these drone attacks that Mossad is doing, because Ukraine has made threats to Iran, like we've warned you like once, or something like that. And Ukraine, and they were like, and Iran was like, you want to explain that? And they're like, no, we don't. So
Shahed drones got destroyed. There was a Shahed drone factory that got destroyed. That's not the thing that the Israelis came in to do. They don't give a crap about Shahed drones. They want to take out the nuclear facilities and all the other military-industrial complex targets, right?
The Shahed drone is designed to penetrate the Iron Dome, so I would say they absolutely have a moral interest there. But also, Israel.
They did it for Ukrainians, I think.
Yeah, so I think there's no way to do it without Mossad being involved. Just like how when Al Qaeda targets get taken out in Iran, it's always Mossad who does it. Like it's always, and the thing is, and that's the thing is because you see the policy, like everyone's saying is like whatever Israel wants to do, we're behind them. Is all they're saying is they're not going to do it. They're going to let Israel do it. And that's the thing is that Iran is already at war with Israel. To deny that it's not is just ludicrous. And it's not like they haven't done it to Saddam before, and nothing bad happened.
It's great for the Americans because they don't want to get tied up anywhere else, and the Iranian deal has fallen through. Like there is no cobbling that back together. So letting the Israelis handle that problem, which is how they see it, is they're all for it. Especially since it's going to actively harm Russia's chances of gaining weapons like Shahed drones, which are an actual issue for Ukrainian anti-air, because they're cheap, and Ukrainian anti-air has to use up a lot of ammunition to shoot them down. It's really screwing them financially. Like the cost-use difference between the Shaheds versus the anti-air is so huge. So yeah, if the Israelis take them out, that's incredibly useful for the Ukrainians, and also works for the Israelis. Which is why I think the Ukrainians are less critical of the Israelis publicly now. Because they were for a while, and all of a sudden that's changed.
Because Israel won't take a side.
But wasn't Israel funding or sending arms to Azov? Wasn't that a thing, or was that Russian propaganda as well?
I'd say Israel had a bit of a Turkey policy where it was kind of playing both sides a bit for a while. Because they obviously want to show the West that they are not like completely abandoning Ukraine and they take Western commitment to it seriously. But they also don't want to antagonize Russia because they want to have the ability to operate in Syria without being shot down with Russian anti-air systems. I think they struck a deal secretly with the Russians to say, like, we're going to go after IRGC targets, and in exchange, like, you're not going to target us. And we won't take such an antagonistic stance on Ukraine. But maybe the Israelis are realizing that there's probably no point of trying to be reasonable. And so now they're actively screwing Russia over by, harming the Iranians as brutally as they are right now, with all these kinetic strikes everywhere.
Speaking of Israel, it just reminded me how the conspiracy came out that there is a cabal of Israeli working to favor their interest in certain politics, and I was just like, just how it's gonna just give credence to all these conspiracy theories about Jews and things like that. Not like every country doesn't have these same thing that influence politics, but so it just gets into the topic of information warfare, and how Israel is one of the best at it.
Yeah, everyone talks about this information war stuff like it's exclusively a Russia-Ukraine thing, but even on that conflict itself, there are so many other sides probably doing their info war stuff. I'm sure Iran and China are actively involved in pushing anti-Ukrainian narratives, and I'm sure the West is doing their own stuff, targeting Russian populations with like propaganda to make them more nervous about the victory and stuff like that, to make them more nervous about Russia's prospects. So
I think
and all these states learn from each other.
I think a lot of it is like you can see that there is intimidation tactics going on. Like the whole thing with like threatening nukes, like there's not an actual nuclear threat going on. Putin just knows that it's making the right wing more adamant about not sending arms to Ukraine, and he is desperately trying to claw in there and really use the fringe that he's built up over the years. Because it's like, I mean, we literally have Russian agents in our government now, basically. Like, they don't even know they're on the paybook for Russian. They're just that stupid that they've been manipulated into it.
So Russian disinformation is really good in that it has like a second order effect. People don't really know that they're spouting anything Russian.
It's because it
anymore.
operates on half-truths.
Yeah.
It's so effective because it operates on half-truths. It finds these things like there's some American-funded biolabs, and then they're making bioweapons in them, ignoring the fact that there's no like high-level biosecurity level labs in Ukraine anyway. But it doesn't matter to them because it's all about the fact that there are labs. It's got nothing to do with the specifics. It's just ranting for ranting's sake.
It's interesting. Anything framed as like Western money in Ukraine is seen as like this nefarious plot by Western states to fund something that's going to screw Russia over. And the crowd that are pushing this idea that all of this is a waste of money and America doesn't have good infrastructure because we're sending billions to Ukraine or whatever. They kind of capitalize off that idea of like this money is going to destabilize a country in the most cruel way possible, and no one is benefiting from it at all, and it's all so horrible, and no one's winning and everyone's losing. So we need to make sure that we don't give a single penny more to Ukraine. I think it's how Marjorie Taylor Greene puts it. It's very cynical, and it arguably has a lot more Russian origin than even Marjorie Taylor Greene or any of these other useful idiots know it does.
Dumb anecdote. What's really funny is if you look at because that's one of the things that I like to do is look at conspiracy theorists and stuff like that. Like, I really like looking at Pakistan and like Turkey and how they believe America caused the earthquake. I like looking at those types of things. But what's really funny is that if anyone writes an article with a stock photo, they'll lose their minds. Like, there's like photos of like, it's like reporting on COVID, and they're like, clearly it's a mannequin being like carried for like a stock photo. and they are like so behind that conspiracy, it'll be like, bro, it's a stock photo. Here it is. I found the image tag. It's like, do you think stock photos have to do with conspiracies? And they're like, only when it has to do with COVID. Like the way that they'll get in these tracks and just like go down these rails and where they can't like invalidate anything is just insane.
I think that's interesting. You touch on a misunderstanding some people have about InfoWar, which is this idea it disables all critical thinking. That isn't actually true. It just focuses on selectively making people critical on stuff. So, for example, a lot of the disinformation stuff about Ukraine, the critical thinking is turned off about the idea that, like, without sending money or aid to Ukraine, the war is just going to be prolonged, right? They don't think about that. What they do think about, though, is like there being no sight and end to this conflict and the increasing risks of a nuclear war. They're very attentive to that, but they're not attentive to like the alternative of what happens if nothing gets sent.
But the other thing that they fundamentally lack is the ability to understand that if Russia didn't invade, none of this would happen, and all that needs to happen is Russia leaves. That's it, and it's over. It's
and
done.
the problem is, I blame the West a bit for that, in that they talk about like Putin can't leave without like losing his power. I'm not sure I buy it. There's plenty of precedents of dictators like managing
to rudely interrupt. I would say that they have a very good point there, because that's exactly how Putin took power with Yeltsin.
I don't know. I think there's been precedents with Saddam Hussein, for example, losing in Kuwait, in retaining power despite losing a war. I think it can be done. And I think people don't understand how repressive the state structure is in Russia to be able to deal with this dissent. I think it's actually a Kremlin talking point to say, like, if you get rid of Putin, something worse can come. And that, you know, if we lose a war that's not existential in the slightest, where we're not even fighting on our own land, you know, the Russian country will turn upside down. There'll be like 12 different private military companies fighting for control and all of this crap. I think a lot of it's excitement about Russia collapsing, but I think it's actually unhelpful because it creates a false image of like what it's
happened before.
It's true. I'm not dismissing it, but I think there's too much certainty about it. And I don't see a lot of people pushing back on it. And I'm not sure if it's wishful thinking or just doomers worrying that like nukes are going to go in free fall and we're all screwed if Putin goes and all of this stuff.
People are going to think what they're told to think at the end of the day. I think at the end of the day, but a huge part of this is that just had this pathetic little rally that they had, and there was all kinds of characters that showed up to that, and it just kind of shows where Russian disinformation affects, and it clearly is people who don't go outside and touch grass very often, and that's kind of what we saw.
Yeah, it was very weird fringe think tankers and just straight up attention seekers. It's actually the two most common types of people that spout this disinformation on behalf of the Russians.
Well, it's funny because they ran a cover campaign to try and explain away the Russian flags that were there. But it turns out that CPI, the Center for Political Innovation, they claim that they're the ones who brought the flags because they weren't associated, even though they were one of the sponsoring organizations and were on the poster. So, like, if you're working with people who will literally bring Russian flags and you're letting people speak like Grey Zone, Max Blumenthal, and Jackson Hinkle, among others, who just are openly pro-Russian and openly support the invasion, I mean, you're not really anti-war, are you? You're pro-invasion.
What I found funny about that was that Scott Ritter still got disinvited. Even Scott Ritter is so bad that even that crowd of people could not handle him being there. And I think it's because some people claim it's because of his pedophile conviction. I have the feeling it was actually because he wrote something that was so emphatically pro-war that they couldn't even justify bringing him in. I think it was something about like an Atticus Finch quote and calling like Ukraine a rabid dog that needs to be put down.
Well, it's funny you mention that because Jackson Hinkle, the day after, went on to Russian state television, and then the day after that posted a tweet that literally outright said, how you've asked if I support the special operation. He goes, yes. Just straight up just said yes. So,
He went
I
on
mean,
Solovyov's show. Solovyov's
yeah.
a very big propagandist.
So you've got all of this, and he wants to claim that he's anti-war.
I think it shows you how small and desperate these groups are. The fact that they can't even unite people that have a consistent message on the war.
This shit looks. This isn't the crowd that came up today. This is like a pride event. They got like German flags. It's like they're trying to like. What is this like? Is this this is a different rally? Okay, never mind. Sorry, I thought it was like some like thing that they're trying to mislead people with, like showing fake crowds and stuff.
Knowing East Germany as well, I bet you there's a lot of fascists in that crowd, because that's a population that's been targeted a lot. The East Germans have been very radicalized by Russian disinfo. But even that's not a very big crowd for a country like that. And that's the thing, the Russian disinfo tries to portray these movements as so huge. And it's all these people hate Ukraine and it's so terrifying. But you look at the size of the crowds, a lot of them aren't actually very big. And the events themselves are not very impressive. You know, Jackson Hinkle as a speaker is not exactly a mark of an exciting event of anti-war protest, you know?
He's such a doofus.
He's an attention seeker. I don't think he even has a view. He just thrives off the attention. He was a Bernie guy for a bit.
Why are they all Bernie guys though? Isn't that weird?
Very, very weird. I don't know what it is. I think people like all the gray zone guys, they realize at some point that a career in defending dictators is just really, really easy. It pays so much money as well. Because Aaron Mate is like a well-off guy because of this. Or Max Blumenthal as well. They make a lot of money. Even though I look at their engagement and they're not actually getting read that much.
But like Aaron there, he's like people forget this, but he actually started on Democracy Now!
And now he's on Jimmy Dore.
And like was Nicaragua, Ortega, right? So, or there was just elections. This was maybe 2-3 years ago. There was an elections. Obviously, he was locking up political opponents and stuff. And so, like, Democracy Now! Reported on it absolutely neutral, like, said that there's, reports that he's jailed opponents, like, totally neutral reporting. And he's like, disgusting. I can't believe that this is how they would report on this. Like, and it's like, bro, they're just, like, reporting, like, what happened. People did say this. And it just, like, triggered all of the useful idiots to start being outraged by it. I don't
Did you see how he denies the Assad war crimes, like with the
Oh,
chemical
my God.
attack? It's really pathetic. He uses this one weird source that claims that all the investigation was rigged. And the weird thing is like he ignores like all the other investigations that prove that he did use them anyway. And in that one investigation, it turns out other people came out and an OPCW did a report again, and they invalidated the only claim that he had of this guy going on record saying how everything was
he's been
rigged.
having a meltdown because of it for a brief little period. There's no question it happened, but I think there is an interesting question to be asked on if chemical rockets were sent back, because when we're talking about things like chlorine, it's extremely easy to weaponize that as a chemical, you know? So I've heard stories about rebels using chemical weapons, but I've also seen like no definitive evidence of the rebels using chemical weapons.
It's also too much of a talking point with a lack of proof, which is a sign that it's mostly a malicious narrative. The problem is every time I've heard it, there's a connotation of like the CIA is giving these white helmet guys and these rebels chemical weapons to antagonize Assad so they can frame him up. And then destabilize poor Syria that loves Assad and all of this crap. That's the problem. The fact finding that these guys claim they do is always got a nefarious agenda. So even if you...
Here's just a theory, right? As the Daegu plays the toy in the background, but here's just a theory. If they're raiding Assad's munitions and Assad already had chemical rounds to begin with, how would these people know that they're actually using a chemical round? You load that artillery shell and you'll never know. I mean, there was plenty of times in Iraq where we were finding chemical munitions that were like rotted in the middle of the desert that like somebody forgot about.
Again, it's one of those things where it's very possible, but it's just the issue is that Aaron doesn't need much proof to concoct that narrative, and that's the problem with a lot of these so-called, critical anti-imperialist journalists is a lot of them just don't think fact-finding actually matters. It's about always trying to find a counter-narrative, whether there is one or not. And that's the real issue with those type of people. They actually do a disservice to people who are trying to hold governments accountable. Because whenever other journalists do, they can just say, oh, are you like Aaron Mate? Do you just blame the US government for everything? Are you fabricating this as well? That's the real problem with these people's types of journalism. It makes it living hell for people actually trying to do proper fact finding.
Aaron Mate is like kind of like our favorite one to pick on him, but as far as like the disinformation network, he's really more of like the Assad narrative, and like the Russian disinformation network goes a lot deeper,
The scary types aren't people like Aaron who are like career grifters. The scary types are people like Dmitry Simes who owns national interest, who's a Russian asset, for example. Those are the scary people. Because in DC, it's considered respectable to write for the national interest. It's still considered normal, and no one in America questions it. And Dmitry Simes himself, who owns the national interest, has gone on Russian state TV. Everyone knows who he is. Those people scare me the most because I don't see the West doing anything serious about that. Arguably, maybe there is nothing that can be done.
Freedom of the press.
Yeah.
And to interrupt you, since I already started, this is something that I kind of say is that, it's that Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. Freedom of the press and freedom of the speech are two of the most dangerous things that you can actually give people at the same time. And that's the thing is that people have taken their rights for granted in the West, and Russia is exploiting it, and they have been since the 90s. Putin came to power through fascism and disinformation, and he's still using it to this day.
I mean, China does the same thing. Their whole MO is abusing the West's liberties against them. It's all in that unrestricted warfare book.
It's this also why the decadent West narrative exists. It's this idea that the West has these weak points, that their pathetic tolerance and free speech allows them, to have exploited. The issue is that also the ultimate longevity of democratic regimes is longer, but the problem is they are also incredibly vulnerable. And what Western states don't understand is that you do have to fight an information war, and you do have to constantly push back on like these illiberal ideas, or like I say liberal as in basic free speech and all that stuff. Defending that is a constant task, and if you take it for granted, actors will move in to try and make you lose it. And it only takes 5-10 years. I mean, you look at what's happening with the GOP in America, it's terrifying what's mainstream as a view. Like the fact that cooing, that was just such a weird coup.
Well, that actually did a lot of damage around the world, because like even Iran was pointing to it and being like, look, elections are fake. Democracy doesn't exist. Clearly Donald Trump won. And those things is like Trump was in line with all of these people. And that's the thing is, it's like the deal that he made with Kim was fucking insane. Like where he's like, why don't we just talk to North Korea? You can't fucking talk to North Korea.
He got him out though.
He did.
You got to give him that.
Cool.
He got him out. He will forever be remembered for that picture of him crossing the line.
So actually, you mentioned the Trump's opening a can of worms of the election denial stuff. I remember Myanmar started using that excuse. They said like, oh, all the voting is rigged and it's all fake, so the military government actually has to make sure that these votes are real. So we're going to take power until then. And then, you had Brazil as well. You had their little January 6th episode. It's actually terrifying what a precedent one guy like that can set for the whole world, because every authoritarian state is now using that playbook. Um,
Well, it's like also you look at like how many laws he broke and how criminal it should be, and our criminal justice system isn't even set up to like prosecute the president, you know. So there's like all these holes and stuff, and then he has defenders inside his own party, and it's really insane to me that like there is a plausible chance that like this dude could get elected again and just basically give Ukraine to Russia, give Taiwan to China, and just like do like horrible fucking havoc on the entire world.
the only thing I'll say to that is the DOJ and FBI really want him nailed for stuff. The FBI have a very personal vendetta with Trump. And they will keep going
I
after him
used to
regardless
say
of
that I
administration.
wouldn't be surprised if the FBI arrested him as he was leaving the Oval Office. I used to say that, and I honestly believed it. And I'm surprised it didn't happen. Honestly, I think it would have been. I think they didn't. They don't bother because it's going to cause like a riot and this reaction and all this stuff. And he has all these. He has a little fascist army behind him.
Yeah,
It
like
is terrifying that militia network he has behind him. If things go badly for him, it's scary that he could just mobilize a bunch of these like 2% types and
He literally could give the word, being like, you know, like attack the democracy, bring arms and stuff like that. He could do that. He wouldn't, because like that would be really stupid. But he is really stupid at the same time. This is just something that could happen. That obviously won't. Just like Putin could use nukes in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think in both cases, there's always an appreciation of leaders like that to know that they have those kinds of options, and just letting other people know that they have those kind of options gives them a lot of power as well. People talk about Putin making nuclear threats. He doesn't actually make them himself. He has his propagandists do it for him on TV. But what he does say is basically stuff that is like a subtle threat, like saying, you know, if West keeps sending arms, then this will spiral into something that's terrible. It's not really a threat, but everyone knows what that means, right?
I've seen him say we have nuclear weapons and we'll use them.
He said that for, I think, when it was the referendum, you know, where they had those fake referendums for the 4 regions that were annexed.
That was, yes, you're correct. I think that's what, yeah.
But
he said, like,
it's also in the Russian military doctrine that tactical nuclear weapons are in their arsenal and they will use them.
Do we think military doctrine matters for this man? Because from everything I've seen, everything goes on the fly for the Russians.
That'll be the justification for it, though. He'll be like, well, it's in our doctrine.
He'll say that they made him do it.
I have a feeling it's the best play he has right now is to move those nukes to Belarus. That's the one play that he has that isn't actually risking nuclear war and nuclear exchanges. But the problem is, I think the Americans are going to respond by shifting stuff to Poland. So I don't know. With this nuke situation, I don't know how either side can actually coerce the other with nukes in any way that's meaningful to any of them.
Well, that's the thing that I was saying, like, it's way more realistic to see a chemical weapon used by Russia there, but we don't know how weaponized their chemical arsenal is. Like, they've made claims about weaponizing these extremely complex level, like 6 nerve agents and stuff like that. But as far as we know, you can't really use it in like a binary shell. You can't launch Novichok in a binary shell as far as we know. You know, who knows? Dispersal's
a real problem. And it's very hard if you're in windy conditions for it not to go on your own forces, or in general for it to even spread in the way that you want it to. It's why general chemical weapons are just such a messy thing to use. It's unlikely that they're effective or they even go in the right place. This reminds me of, you know, a funny video where, like, I think cops used tear gas outside the Capitol at one point, and the tear gas actually went back on the police itself. And it's just like ridiculous, like how susceptible those weapons are to just basic things like wind and all of that. And
I mean, this is World War One. With like one of the first times they tried to use chlorine, they killed themselves.
I think also both states have created taboo. Ukraine and Russia both talk about chemical weapons as being horrible, and like the Russians have accused the Ukrainians of using chemical weapons. There's actually been fake accusations of chemical weapons on both sides being used.
I have a post that I saw the other day. There are these little like gel ball mints, and they were like claiming that it was rat poison, and it's like the amount of rat poison you need to kill somebody is fucking insane. Like, it is not something that kills people.
There was also a stupid video by like a Ukrainian drone unit that like had
Yeah,
these things in his fridge that was labeled as chemical weapons, but I think it was just shitposting. And the problem is that shitposting is really stupid, but both sides seem to be obsessed with doing it for whatever reason. Maybe it's just like info ops or for giggle.
well, this
But
is something that people were asking me a lot. We were seeing the ISIS flag among the Ukraine forces, and people were asking me about this a lot. So I started looking into it, and like the size of people that I had, like I saw like a rune on the throat fascist guy with with the finger up, the ISIS flag with somebody else. Like I've seen it on like a lot of people's arms and stuff, and I figured out that this is an inside joke with drone operators because Russia always compares them as using ISIS tactics because ISIS were like the first ones to pioneer this type of drone warfare.
I think there's always an underestimation when people look at like the symbology of like what the Ukrainians or Russians even wear. A lot of it's just fucking really internal, stupid humor. There is obviously the fash stuff, and like people do downplay it a bit much, but like,
But I think a lot of that fascist stuff is also like just kind of
yeah,
part of embracing a meme at this point. And like they know that it pisses off Russia, and that's the sole reason they do it.
even the right adjacent groups, like you can tell there might be some fascists in them, but a lot of them are just doing it for shit posting. Like in general, when you look at the actual posts, all you see them talking about is like we want to kill the enemy, blah 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 blah, or like montages of them killing shit. There's very few times where you actually see them like committedly talk about like white nationalist topics, right?
So I think
Um,
it's pretty reflective of Chan culture.
yeah, yeah. There was one group that was like posting about like, oh, it's the Austrian painter's birthday today, and everyone's like, oh, Adolf's birthday, and like they were just pretending to be like really happy about Adolf Hitler's birthday, and you can tell like barely any of them were serious. But the problem is the irony of like them talking about it is the whole joke. Um, and so it's very funny to see people often read all these symbols and take them extremely seriously, like ISIS flags on Ukrainian guys and anime patches on Russian soldiers and all of that stuff. It's just all a lot of it's all just completely stupid shite for the units to amuse themselves very often.
Talk a bit about Wagner.
Uh, what aspect of Wagner I can talk about the tactics or
Yeah, we can talk about their tactic and talk about where they are and how they use their tactics.
so if we're talking about Ukraine, um, I've spoken to a few journalists about this, and what they seem to do is people have this misconception of them using human waves, which in like a World War I fashion, where hundreds of men go charging and they're all getting gunned down by Ukrainians.
So
The reality,
I actually have a lot of opinions on human wave tactics because I actually have like basically seen them firsthand, like not like up close or anything like that, but like there have been events because like this was like one of ISIS's principal strategies was using human wave tactics, and the reason they were so successful at first to build the caliphate was because they were using these types of tactics. But immediately when they like fought the Kurds, like you would go out there and there'd just be thousands of bodies outside the like city lines, like where a hill was being defended, because they literally like are sending like these fat kids in flip-flops that came from Britain, like basically not even giving them a gun. They give them like a knife and like tell them to go for it. And they were just getting mowed down because if you're trained and you know how to shoot, like you shoot the guys behind the line so they don't even know the dudes behind them are dropping, and you can just start taking down the entire line and sweep them like that.
so that's the thing. The comparison between like what ISIS do and what Wagner do is misleading. Like a lot of people, I think, on the Ukrainian side want to portray it as like hundreds of guys being launched and just getting machine gunned. What actually happens is they're sent in small groups of 5 or 10, and the reason why they're sent is because professional Wagner units that are behind them send out drones and see the convicts being attacking positions and seeing where artillery is firing from, where Ukrainians are, and then based on that intelligence, then the professional elements will later on conduct their assault. So it actually is quite effective. And when you see these bodies of like 50 or 100 Wagner guys, what's happened is that that's been over hours and hours because they will send 9 and 10 man group teams every so often until they can basically do a professional assault, right? But that adds up so much over time, and it's done on so many different axes of attack, that you do get these footages of like these 10 or 20 poorly equipped conscripts, not convicts, sorry, just lying in a field. And there was a bit of too much of a memeing about like how useless Wagner is using them, but they were doing it to reduce like their burn rates for their professional guys. It's not a sustainable strategy, but it worked for them for a while in Bakhmut. And the Wagner guys had to expend a lot of ammunition and stuff to deal with it. So I've seen this video. It's the guy has a Telegram channel called Terminator.
Well, yeah, because what I was gonna say is like this is what I think is a pretty textbook scenario where it's like this guy, like he's clearly experienced, he knows what he's doing, like, and he's just like these guys have no idea. There's like moments where they're way out in the open, and you can see them just like lining themselves up to be shot. And I think this is the exact type of shit you're talking about. Is like Ukraine is just putting like one guy out there because it's so much harder to like probe the positions when you have guys like this out there. So they're sending these inexperienced guys in like small groups, and that's why this guy knows that he could get a quick, awesome video real quick because he knows there's only going to be like 10 guys coming.
That's the thing. The Ukrainians always adapt to this stuff because the issue is you can't give complex orders to convicts like that. So it's really, really easy to adapt. And yeah, this is kind of the right strategy to have one guy handling this small team rather than having loads of clumped up Ukrainians ready to, get shelled by artillery that Wagner guys can scout, positions with for drones and stuff.
And then also when it comes down to, I mean, we were talking about the Shahed drones, right, and the economic cost of it. Well, I mean, if at the end of the day, there is an economic cost to human life. Like when you look at it as a war, it's all about the StarCraft game. You have to care about your units economy. So the thing is like when it comes to Wagner, how many of their guys are going to send to kill one guy? So it's, and I'm talking about the elite guys, like once they know this guy is here, are they really going to go through the trouble of like sending an entire elite team out to kill this one guy out there?
So I can tell you the elite guys are craftier than that. The elite guys do infiltration, reconnaissance, and sabotage operations. And when they're sent into, for example, forests or to go behind, Ukrainian positions, they do slaughter a lot of the guys. So a lot of the guys in those backline positions are territorial defense force guys. So the professional guys, like the way that they're used, it does cause real problems. And because they're quite ballsy and they have that experience fighting in a lot of them have that experience fighting in Libya, Syria, or even, in Ukraine before 2022, they're no joke. And actually I've seen videos of what is clearly Ukrainian special forces hunting these infiltration reconnaissance teams. And sometimes they'll wear Ukrainian uniforms as well, the Wagner guys. So they can be a real fucking issue to deal with. The professional ones, they're no joke.
So it's like right at the start of the war, they had, hunter-killer teams disguised in Ukrainian uniforms going after people and like just committing
what's insane? I was just gonna say, what's actually insane? There's a semi-state security formation or PMC called Readout, and they were sent in from Belarus, and they sent literally thousands of guys. And you know what their job was? To take out the internal intelligence service of Ukraine in Kiev. Literally take out the whole building. And they all failed. But they managed to actually get to the place to start trying to do it. And what's terrifying is they sent in so many people, and if the West didn't give the intelligence to the Ukrainians about this, they arguably could have succeeded. Because they sent in some of the best guys they had. Very well equipped, with billionaires buying them light armored vehicles and giving them the best healthcare and giving them the best weapon modifications and all of that. It was actually really terrifying to read about because everyone was like, oh, the Russians got battered so badly in that assault. But things were quite scary in a lot of places and a lot of times. If the US intel wasn't there, who knows how bad it could have been. because otherwise Ukrainians would have dispersed their like equipment, right? They wouldn't have placed that whole brigade in the airport that the Russians tried to land the VDV in. It could have been a real shit show.
It's too bad we couldn't have this type of intelligence support with our Afghan allies.
Yeah. Oh, the Afghan thing is another thing entirely. I still don't know what to make of the withdrawal, to be honest.
Oh, I have opinions on it. Basically, that it's needed to happen when it happened because it's all going to come down to it was going to be an election issue if he canceled that. And then they're going to say that he's a warmonger because he's in Afghanistan and in Ukraine. So because we knew what was coming down the pipeline, we basically were in a scenario where we had to pull out. But the thing is the way we pulled out, like we were out of there, like, and we had to turn around and come back because like we didn't provide any logistical support, and we let Pakistan completely get behind the Taliban and just wipe out these people who we spent so many years and so much money building up, and we're not even gonna like give them a little bit of intelligence. And you remember they're like giving estimates. We're like, oh, they could probably hold out for 6 months. That's like it's ridiculous because the same thing was said about Ukraine, right? Where they said they're going to get destroyed, they're going to be wiped out by Russia. I even said it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it happened, and on day 3, they're like still like holding on, like Russia's in a traffic jam, and like, you know, nothing's even moving. You see it locked down, and you're like, oh, this war is actually going to last. And I think one of the big factors there was probably the intelligence.
I would say the real-time intelligence is one thing. I would say there was another thing. Pulling the US air support. Fuck the Afghans. I'm sorry, they were just not trained long enough to be able to handle air operations by themselves. The only reason why
not trained long enough, and then also we're fighting a state power that was giving intelligence to their enemy.
Yeah. And yeah, the 2 and 2 go in hand. For close air support, you need intelligence. My other issue was that the amount of special forces Afghan guys that left behind. We actually have rumors that some of them are recruited by Wagner to train Russian soldiers. I mean, that's a fucking disaster to not try and evacuate all of those special forces guys. At the very least, like what an unbelievable decision to take, right? A lot of people argue there wasn't any other way to withdraw other than this hasty way. But I think there was no excuse to leave behind that many interpreters or that many. If you're going to be cynical and say, you know, Afghan was going to fall anyway, at least take back the guys that you've trained so much, right? Otherwise, you're just going to fall into the hands of someone else. I think arguably in a cynical way, you could argue that this is a good decision long term and that it creates a problem for China and Pakistan now. And even the Russians potentially, to have this unstable region with a government that doesn't really work. But
so I think, like I said, when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, human lives have an economic cost. And as far as America's concerned, that these lives are just not valuable. And that's what it comes down to, is that the amount of money that it would take to continually support a logistic effort here, just wiping our hands of it and being out and just, you know, not having to worry about any economic commitment or anything like that. It was just a very cutthroat capitalist measure on just like how to do it with saving money, not about saving lives.
yeah, I think morally, when you see the pictures, you can't like justify the decision. And I think some very cynical people call the shots on that because especially the way that Trump managed to secure that pullout was incredibly messed up. I think during the
This
CIA's
goes
campaign,
back to the whole thing I was saying with North Korea. This is a big part of it. Like dealing with the Taliban the way he did. He gave them everything. Like you just sit like basically shaking hands with Mullah Baradar. Didn't they bring him to like Washington, D.C. or something like that? I know there's a picture of Pompeo shaking his hand, which is like ludicrous to me.
So Pompeo was weird because he was shaking their hand with one hand and he was also actively running arguably the most brutal campaign with a cost protection force being backed by the CIA to basically run absolute havoc on the Taliban. And the thing is, a lot of Taliban got slaughtered in that campaign, but also a lot of civilians died. In that short period, more civilians died than for like years of that conflict. Because that CIA campaign was so fucking brutal. I don't know how you could justify something like that, especially when it led to that kind of pullout. The fact that like that's something that no one gets any crap for like doing what they did with the Coast Protection Force, which is, by the way, recognized as a terrorist group by the UN.
We've actually have talked about the Coast Protection Force before, but not in a while, and maybe not on this show specifically. But and then they also are notorious for operating inside of Pakistan as well. So they were actually a hunter-killer team that would go across state lines into Waziristan and apprehend people, and they would also authorize and do forward operations for close airstrikes on these people and stuff like that. So it's like when we see like airstrikes in Waziristan and like drone strikes in Waziristan, a lot of times there was like human agents on the ground directing those strikes to happen to limit the amount of civilian casualties. Obviously, when you bomb a wedding, you can see when there's not those types of people there, but there is evidence that these things were being called in on the ground, which is like super illegal, you know. But
and it's US
we're the
armed
world police.
Overwatch. It's US armed Overwatch as well. Those are US drones.
The call sign I think was Eagle as well.
Yeah,
which was the CIA base at the time.
that was what was so messed up, was that they were basically close air support was always next to these Coast Protection Force guys. They were really, really, really well equipped. Really well equipped.
Aid to Ukraine?
Yeah, can do. So there's basically a faction within, Olaf Scholz's inner circle, his inner advisors, who believe that we can still go back to something that was like German and Russian relations before the war. It's a very desperate idea that if we're soft on Russia, that things might get back to normal, and we're not going to go into nuclear war, and also Europe will be more stable for it. The problem is that obviously the Russians don't seem to appreciate any of these so-called softer measures that the Germans have adopted. I mean, Leopard tanks are still being sent. Everything is done by Germany that the Russians don't want, just at a slower pace, and no one's really benefiting from it. And the problem is that all NATO countries are trying to practice a graduated escalation where they don't send too much to spiral things, but they steadily want to send stuff over time. The problem is what the Americans think is like risky is like up here, and the Germans are only willing to meet it like here. And that's basically the whole hesitation is about like it spiraling into a never-ending conflict, German weapons being used to go on to march on Moscow, and obviously the nuke stuff. Those are the real three main things that are stopping them from perhaps being a little bit more decisive, but they have done a lot as well. They are one of the biggest contributors of aid.
There's only one stabilizing force in Europe.
America.
To wrap up at the end here, we sent a few links to each other, so I figured we could pull up some of the stuff that we've sent in here just for a little wrap up period, and
yeah, that sounds good.
Let's start right with this one. The new information narrative. General Michael Flynn. Oh, I got DMs open, but it's just you, so it's going to be okay. But General of the military is now going on record saying that there's no war footage of Ukraine.
Flynn was always a nutcase, though.
I know, but it's just like, it's the fact that it's like this was a guy was a general, and the fact that he got there, it just amazes me how easily, if somebody really, especially back in the history, like wanted, like the libertarians are always talking about how like Lincoln is a dictator or something. Like, imagine if something actually was like a dictator in those times, how fucked America would have been.
He is the only president to suspend the Constitution. Fuck that guy. And something that I don't know if it's true or not, but I heard something that what was it called, the something proclamation that gave the
Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, it was only for southern states, but the northern slaves weren't freed until the 13th Amendment, something like that. So I don't know if that's true, but I saw that somewhere. I thought if that was true, that'd be pretty funny. So I don't know.
No. So this is what you're getting confused of. The Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves in the Union. The Confederacy wasn't part of the Union. So that's what I think you're thinking of. As far as like suspending the Constitution or anything like that, it was a civil war.
The whole state system and the constitutional system was
and also
dysfunctional.
You didn't bring up the big one, which is that he had like the most executions of like natives of any president.
Did he really? That's an interesting fact.
Mm-hmm. Killed a lot of. There was like it was because there was the biggest native raid in like U.S. history occurred during his presidency, or something like that, and they like hung a bunch of them or something.
This cat's herd stuff. Yeah, I was just showing like these screenshots of like everyone talking about like with Vietnam, you saw more footage and stuff like that, and it's a copy and plastered message. You know what it is? I'm not sure how much of it's Russian disinfo and how much of it's like just contrarianism for the sake of being contrarian.
It's super hard to dig through. Like
it's always
really,
so hard to tell
to define.
Because I guess the copy and pasted messages come across as actual disinfo lines. Because the intensity of how many people are talking about there being no footage of the war.
But it feels
like such an unnatural spike.
It's the copy pasted nature of it.
Yeah.
You know? And it's like Cat Turd is like a pretty well known like account.
So it isn't an alt-right account.
Yeah, something like that. But that's the thing is like Elon Musk is like direct communication with this account. We see it all the time.
Elon Musk talks to some actual Nazis. Like he talks to Ian Miles Strong all the time. He talks to Andy No. Talks to all kinds of people that are just. I think that's probably one of the things that's tanking the company, to be honest. He was also pushing this propaganda stuff about Victoria Nuland being the only person that wanted the war or something like that.
Is this where they used her saying that there are biolabs to justify their bioweapon bullshit? Because there are biolabs, they're just insignificant because everyone funds biolabs everywhere?
I think no, they were talking about the call where she was saying like they were naming people like, oh, we're in play now, fuck the EU, like these are the people we're going to get in cabinet, and they were talking about people who would be included in a peace deal with not peace deal, like a deal with Yanukovych, but people portrayed it as them like picking a government from a coup or something like that. Which is just a ridiculous understanding of like how Euromaidan happened.
I was like looking at like what was going to be pulled next, and like I didn't realize we were talking about Euromaidan, because that's one of my favorite things considering I was there.
You were there.
Yeah, so it's like really funny is because they'll like I don't really fuck with people a lot online, but like at the beginning of the war, before like they were like really cut off and like NAFO existed, people would be talking about Euromaidan, and like I'd let them go on and on and on, and I would be like, yeah, I was there, and like shut them down because they're so used to like the tankies are so used to engaging with people who like aren't Ukrainian or weren't there. But like as far as like journalists go, like every journalist was there.
It's just ridiculous how you could be uninformed about it when it was like the most covered. Well, the most just ridiculous.
Yeah, so this is something that I talk about is that being in college at the time and coming back and like nobody having any idea what happened, nobody talking about it, and I'm like, are we like? I just saw like. I mean, I didn't see anything really. I was just in the hotel the whole time because I wasn't about to go outside because like I'm not gonna go fucking die for like a shitty internship that I'm getting college credit for. But you know, people just overthrew a government with rocks, you know, and like just coming and like the fact that it's like just seeing people die like that, and just like the West just completely oblivious and just like nobody gives a shit about anything at all ever here. It's like the
That's my.
isolation is insane.
You know what was dangerous about that? It was arguably what opened the way for the Russian disinfo to take hold so much. The Russians were covering it all the time, and no one in the West gave a crap. And that's why the Russian narratives grew online, because there simply wasn't a counter narrative there. Like even after Crimean annexation, everyone covered it, and it was like, okay, that's it now. Like no one was following a war in like Eastern Ukraine, you know. And that really is what allowed these ideas of Ukrainians being Nazis and it being like a puppet government and Zelensky being an anti-Russian or all of this crap. It all grew because of that lack of.
I mean, you literally like Vice News would be out there covering it, and they would be like, "Oh, now we're gonna go talk to the extreme Nazis," and it's like, and like that's the thing is like even at Euromaidan with like right sector, like that's all like there was a huge focus on that, and like nobody talks about this, but the Georgian Legion was like involved with them. And like the commander of right sector was Georgian. Like I know I was there, like I saw him, and that dude was actually had guns shooting back at the Russians and things like that. But like the details on it on both sides are just completely skimmed out because one side didn't cover it and the other side just lied about everything.
Yep. And the Russians never mentioned the fact that they paid people who are on the far right to something they did during like whenever the Ukrainian Euromaidan crowd would show up, there'd be these like thugs showing up all of a sudden, fighting the protesters, and they're on the Russian payroll.
So what's this here with Jack Murphy about this deep dive of the CIA?
Is this the guy that likes putting dildos in his bum? Is that Jack Murphy? Different one.
It's probably a different one, mate. So this guy, he is a former special forces guy, and he's like doing a lot of journalism, quite controversial stuff. But he claims that he has spoken to people that can prove that the CIA is helping a partner agency conduct sabotage strikes in Russia. And like remember when all this stuff was being set on fire in Russia, and it happened to be all very strategically relevant stuff? Everyone was attributing to the Ukrainians and saying it was partisans.
Well, what
The
about
claim is
the
that it was
execution of little Dugan girl?
Yeah, that's
based.
That's a whole other thing. I have my theories, but what I do know is with
they
this,
didn't get them both.
It's on the Dugan himself.
It would have been a
Daria.
very good situation. It would have crippled Putin's inner circle, I reckon, because a lot of them apparently are influenced by Dugan. Well, he's got their ear apparently.
See, I've heard that. I'm not sure how true that is.
I don't think it's true at all. And
yeah.
I didn't hear what you actually said. It cut out, but when I brought up like them killing their daughter, but I assumed you said that like it was to punish Dugan himself or something like that. Is that what you said? Is that a good guess?
No, I was just saying that yeah, Dugan wasn't necessarily the target. That they could have just been going after Daria specifically.
Why though?
There's so many different
but
parties
why?
they could go. There's a range of theories. One is that the Ukrainians are trying to create a false image of a resistance movement in Russia. The other was that it was the Russians cleaning up internal business. Maybe Daria was speaking to someone she wasn't supposed to, or that it was Daria owing money to someone. But people underplay her importance. She was the daughter who was going to succeed the Eurasianist movement in Russia. And the Russian state has a lot of incentive to control a nationalist movement like that from it not like dissenting with the government. And maybe the Russians saw something that was not good. And the reason why I think it might have been someone in Russia is because they came out with a really quick theory that it was Azov guys who assassinated her. And it was like the most ridiculous theory as well, like that it was a mother who was living in Russia that used to be in Azov that was doing all of this. And they also had a picture of like some guy in a weird hat as well as another one. So I don't think the Russians are being honest about who actually did it. But I'm not sure if it was like a Russian job or if it was a Ukrainian job. I know the Americans categorically denied it.
So right here it says a NATO intelligence ally. That doesn't necessarily mean someone in NATO, right? It just means somebody who we work with on an intelligence level, right?
It has to be someone who can get cells into Russia. And it's got to be someone in. My bet is either it's the UK
what about
or
Mossad?
one of the Baltic countries.
What about Mossad?
But I don't think the Mossad guys would want to risk it, to be honest. I don't think they're that committed on Russia in general. I think they're Russia and Ukraine's a relatively peripheral thing right now, but they've got Iran going on and stuff, you know. My bet is that for the Eastern European countries, because the Eastern European countries could get agents in really easily. Yeah, it's definitely someone in it's either the UK or any of those countries I mentioned, the Baltic ones. Because to operate a cell,
Every time I pressed unmute, I pressed the message key. So we had, besides like at the end here, we had a pretty clean recording. But go ahead, and then whatever Jack wants to like wrap on or something like that.
Oh yeah, I was just.
But you talk first, though, just to be clear. Fuck the damn interference.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, yeah. Basically, some agents that were able to speak Russian fluently and could fit in a cell for years would have to have been the people that were doing it. And I reckon there's only a very small list of countries that could actually do it that well. And it's also a very expensive operation. So either the Americans helped fund it, or there's a country that's got enough money to actually do this kind of thing. It would cost billions to plan this all out, to do the surveying, to like have the caches of explosions, to have the fake identities and everything. It's a really difficult thing to do.
I think to wrap, how do you think, where do you think Russia's going to stand in 5 years?
Either it has a relatively smooth transition of power to another Putinist thug, or the country literally starts imploding. When I say imploding, I'm talking about like separatist movements starting up. Talking about organized crime getting out of hand. All of these guys are forming these like private military companies will have enough small arms to start like having hired muscle. So it seems like there's very much a binary. Either Putinism continues or it's just gone. Things are incredibly messy. The least likely scenario I see is like the liberal opposition coming into power. There's still think Navalny will come in, and I just think it's ridiculous. I don't see it.
Whoa,
you can't secure power peacefully in that country.
Liberal opposition and Navalny. Well, those words don't make sense. That's just not two words that can be used together, my friend.
Well, I've seen Russian liberals, and also he himself may not be that liberal, but a lot of the people that are working for him and the people that he represents are arguably pretty liberal. I think the problem is just he's not a good enough alternative to for the Ukrainians or for the West. He's strictly very good for the Russians. If they were going to have some kind of like democratic government that still retains some of that chauvinism and stuff, Navalny's probably their best bet. But he won't ever get to see power. The tactics that they use, the Russian opposition is just very unwilling to recognize that they can't do just some protests and some marches and get a vote. That's just not how stuff like that in Russia works. It's far more like an internal coup happens if any transition of power happens like that at all.